afternoon sun cast dappled shadows across the vicarage lawn, where the annual St. Mary Mead Garden Fete was unfolding with all the predictable charm of an English village summer. Bunting fluttered between the apple trees, trestle tables groaned under the weight of homemade preserves and knitted goods, and the brass band from Much Benham wheezed cheerfully through a selection of patriotic airs. Children darted between the coconut shy and the tombola, their excited shrieks punctuating the genteel murmur of village conversation. Miss Jane Marple sat in the shade of the old elm tree, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue cardigan. To the casual observer, she appeared entirely absorbed in her wool, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing of the social tableau unfolding before her. She had attended enough village fetes to know that beneath the veneer of community spirit, human nature revealed itself in all its fascinating complexity. Near the jam stall, Mrs. Dolly Bantry was engaged in animated conversation with Colonel Melchett, their voices carrying just enough for Miss Marple to catch fragments about the new residents at Gossington Hall. At the White Elephant stall, young Dr. Haydock was examining a rather dubious-looking vase, while Mrs. Price Ridley hovered nearby, clearly hoping to offload her late husband's collection of commemorative plates. But it was the activity around the clothing stall that drew Miss Marple's particular attention. Mrs. Venetia Hargreaves, the acknowledged queen of St. Mary Mead Society, was holding court beside a display of donated garments. A handsome woman in her 50s, she possessed the kind of commanding presence that made others instinctively defer to her judgment. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her cream silk dress impeccable, and her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Really, Mrs. Clement," she was saying to the vicar's wife, "these stockings simply won't do for the raffle prizes. Pure silk, indeed. Anyone with half an eye can see they're nothing but artificial silk. We cannot have the parish associated with such deception." The contested items hung from a makeshift clothesline strung between two posts. Several pairs of stockings in various shades, from practical beige to an elegant burgundy. Among them, one pair stood out, exquisite silk stockings in a deep crimson red, so fine they seemed almost translucent in the afternoon light. Mrs. Clement, a gentle soul who avoided confrontation whenever possible, wrung her hands nervously. But Mrs. Hargreaves, they were donated by Pemberton's shop in good faith. Surely we shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. "Gift horse?" Mrs. Hargreaves' laugh held no warmth. "My dear woman, when one's reputation is built on maintaining standards, one cannot afford to be charitable about quality. I've examined these stockings thoroughly, and I can assure you they are not what they purport to be." Miss Marple observed the small crowd that had gathered around this exchange. Young Timothy Fletcher, the bank clerk, stood slightly apart, his face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or anger. Mrs. Pemberton herself was present, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious distress. Even Mr. Julian Lacey, the retired solicitor, had paused in his examination of the bookstall to listen, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps," suggested Dr. Haydock, approaching with his characteristic diplomatic manner, "we might simply label them as fine stockings rather than specify the material. That way no one can claim to have been misled." Mrs. Hargreaves turned her penetrating gaze upon him. "Dr. Haydock, I'm surprised at you. Are we to become a village of euphemisms and half-truths? I believe in calling things by their proper names." Miss Marple noted the slight tightening around Dr. Haydock's eyes at this rebuke. She also observed that Timothy Fletcher had moved closer to the stall, his attention fixed on Mrs. Hargreaves with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the situation. The afternoon progressed with its usual mixture of gentle competition and social maneuvering. The produce judging concluded with Mrs. Bantry's marrows taking first prize, much to Mrs. Price Ridley's visible chagrin. The children's races were run with appropriate enthusiasm, and only minor disputes about photo finishes. Through it all, Mrs. Hargreaves maintained her position as the unofficial arbiter of standards, pronouncing judgment on everything from the consistency of the Victoria sponge to the quality of the hand-knitted tea cozies. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the lawn, preparations began for the grand raffle drawing. The prizes were arranged on a table near the clothesline, with the disputed stockings prominently displayed. Mrs. Hargreaves had won her point about the labeling. They were now marked simply as Ladies' Hosiery, various colors. "Ladies and gentlemen," called the Reverend Clement, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd, "if you would kindly gather round for our grand raffle. The proceeds, as you know, will go toward the repair of the church roof, a cause dear to all our hearts." Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her bag and moved closer to the crowd, her trained eye automatically cataloguing the faces around her. She noticed that Timothy Fletcher had positioned himself near the back, partially concealed behind Colonel Melchett's substantial frame. Mrs. Pemberton stood with her husband, both looking anxious. Dr. Haydock had found a spot with a clear view of the proceedings, while Mrs. Hargreaves had claimed a position of prominence near the prize table. The first several prizes were drawn without incident: a bottle of Colonel Melchett's homemade elderberry wine, a hand-embroidered cushion cover, and a wooden jewelry box crafted by the village carpenter. Each winner was greeted with polite applause and good-natured commentary. "And now," announced the vicar, reaching into the barrel of tickets, "we come to our final prize, the beautiful red silk stockings donated by—" He paused, glancing at Mrs. Hargreaves, who gave him a stern look. "That is, the fine red hosiery, ticket number 43. A moment of rustling as people checked their tickets, then Timothy Fletcher stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "I believe that's mine, Vicar." Mrs. Hargreaves' reaction was swift and cutting. "How perfectly appropriate. The bank clerk wins the false silk. Perhaps he can add them to his collection of other worthless investments." The crowd fell silent, shocked by the venom in her voice. Timothy Fletcher's face went from pale to scarlet, then back to white again. His hands shook as he reached for the prize, but there was something in his eyes that made Miss Marple lean forward slightly, her attention fully focused. "That's quite enough, Venetia," Dr. Haydock said sharply. "Your behavior is completely inappropriate." "My behavior?" Mrs. Hargreaves laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "I'm simply stating facts, Doctor, something this village seems to have forgotten how to do." The crowd began to disperse, the festive atmosphere thoroughly dampened. Miss Marple remained near the prize table, ostensibly organizing her purchases, but actually observing the various reactions. She noticed that Timothy Fletcher had not immediately left with his prize, instead lingering near the clothesline where the remaining stockings still hung in the evening breeze. It was Mrs. Clement who first noticed that something was amiss. She had returned to collect the remaining prizes when she let out a small cry of alarm. "Oh, my goodness, Mrs. Hargreaves, are you quite all right?" Miss Marple turned to see Mrs. Hargreaves, slumped in her chair beside the prize table, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Dr. Haydock was beside her in an instant, his fingers seeking a pulse at her throat, his face grave. "I'm afraid she's gone," he said quietly. "It appears to be her heart." But Miss Marple's attention had been caught by something else entirely. Above them, the clothesline still held its burden of donated garments, swaying gently in the evening breeze. Among them, the remaining stockings hung innocuously, except for one pair. The elegant burgundy stockings that had been part of the disputed donation now hung differently. One stocking twisted and stretched, and from its toe, dark red drops were falling steadily onto the white tablecloth below. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice carrying just enough authority to make him look up. "I think you might want to examine Mrs. Hargreaves more carefully, and perhaps someone should take note of that clothesline before anything is disturbed." The doctor followed her gaze upward, and his expression changed immediately. The drops falling from the stocking were not water, and they were not dye. In the gathering twilight, with the festive bunting still fluttering cheerfully overhead, the annual St. Mary Mead Garden Fête had become the scene of something far more sinister than a dispute over silk stockings. Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle clicking as she began to observe, with the patience and attention to detail that had served her so well in the past, exactly how each person present was reacting to this unexpected turn of events. The stocking that dripped red had told its tale, but Miss Marple suspected that the full story was only just beginning to unfold. The festive chatter died away as if someone had drawn a curtain across the evening air. Dr. Haydock knelt beside Mrs. Hargreaves, his weathered hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had tended to both the living and the dead for more years than he cared to count. The remaining villagers formed an instinctive semicircle around the scene, their voices dropping to the sort of hushed whispers reserved for churches and sick rooms. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing of the unfolding drama. She observed how Timothy Fletcher had retreated further into the shadows, cast by the elm tree, the disputed red stocking still clutched in his trembling hands. Mrs. Pemberton had drawn closer to her husband, seeking comfort in his solid presence, while her usual cheerful countenance had taken on a peculiar pallor that seemed to go beyond mere shock. "I'm afraid this is not a simple case of heart failure," Dr. Haydock announced quietly, his voice carrying the weight of unwelcome certainty. He had lifted Mrs. Hargreaves's silver head slightly, revealing a small dark stain on the collar of her cream silk dress. "There's a puncture wound here, just below the hairline. Very precise, very deliberate." The word deliberate fell among the gathered villagers like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of horrified comprehension through the crowd. Mrs. Clement let out a soft sob, while Colonel Melchett stepped forward with the instinctive authority that military service had bred into his bones. "Good God, Haydock, are you saying she was murdered?" "I'm saying she was killed by something sharp and slender, inserted with considerable precision," the doctor replied grimly. "The symptoms suggest poison as well. See the slight discoloration around the lips? This was no accident and certainly no natural death." Miss Marple's gaze drifted upward to the clothesline, where the burgundy stocking continued its macabre dripping. The pattern of drops on the white tablecloth below had formed an irregular constellation of crimson, each drop marking time like a ghastly metronome. Something about the methodical nature of the dripping struck her as significant, though she could not yet say precisely why. "Constable Troughton," called the Reverend Clement, his voice cracking slightly. "Someone fetch Constable Troughton immediately." The local constable, a well-meaning man more accustomed to mediating disputes over garden boundaries than investigating sudden deaths, arrived with cake crumbs still clinging to his uniform. His eyes widened as he took in the scene, then followed Miss Marple's subtle gesture toward the dripping stocking above. "Merciful heavens," he breathed, pulling out a small notebook with hands that shook slightly. "What in blazes is that thing doing?" Dr. Haydock had risen and was now examining the offending garment with professional interest. Using his handkerchief to avoid direct contact, he carefully lifted the toe of the burgundy stocking. What emerged made several of the onlookers gasp audibly. A long, slender hatpin with an elegant coral head, its steel shaft stained dark near the tip. "Extraordinary," murmured Mr. Lacey, adjusting his spectacles for a better view. "Someone has been remarkably clever about concealment. The stocking served as both hiding place and, what shall we call it, a sort of delayed revelation." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully, her needles never pausing in their work. "Indeed, Mr. Lacey, though I wonder whether the timing was quite as the perpetrator intended. Hatpins are such common things, are they not? Nearly every woman carries one, tucked into a hat or hidden in a reticule. They slip through fabric without a sound and leave such a small mark that one might easily mistake the wound for something else entirely." The observation sent a collective shiver through the assembled ladies, each of whom was suddenly aware of the various pins and needles secreted about their own persons. Mrs. Bantry unconsciously touched her hat, while Mrs. Price Ridley's hand went to her collar, where a small jet pin held her lace in place. Timothy Fletcher had grown even paler, if such a thing were possible, and Miss Marple noticed that his grip on his prize had tightened until his knuckles showed white against the crimson silk. Mrs. Pemberton was staring at the hat-pin with an expression of dawning horror, her lips moving silently as if she were trying to form words that would not come. "But how could anyone have known that Mrs. Hargreaves would be sitting precisely there?" asked Mrs. Clement, her voice barely above a whisper. "The seating wasn't arranged in advance." "Ah, but it was predictable, wasn't it?" Miss Marple observed gently. Mrs. Hargreaves always positioned herself where she could maintain the best oversight of any proceedings. One could count on her claiming the chair nearest to whatever activity was taking place. It was quite her way. Constable Troughton, now fully grasping the gravity of the situation, had begun the process of securing the area around both Mrs. Hargreaves and the clothing stall. His voice gained confidence as he instructed people to step back, though his hands continued to shake as he made notes in his little book. "We'll need Inspector Slack here immediately," he declared, more to himself than to anyone else. "This is well beyond my... That is, the inspector will want to see everything exactly as it was found." The evening air had grown distinctly cooler, and the cheerful bunting now seemed almost mockingly festive in the gathering darkness. Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with renewed interest, noting how the revelation of murder had affected each person differently. The shock was universal, but beneath it lay other emotions. Fear, certainly, but also something that might have been relief in one or two instances, and what appeared to be calculation in others. Most intriguing of all was the behavior of those who had been closest to the clothing stall during the afternoon's activities. Timothy Fletcher's continued nervousness was certainly noteworthy, but so was Mrs. Pemberton's apparent distress, which seemed to encompass more than simple horror at the discovery of a crime. Even Mr. Lacey, despite his professional composure, was observing the scene with the sharp attention of a man who understood that legal complications were about to descend upon their quiet village like a summer storm. The poisoned hat-pin, concealed so cleverly within the burgundy stocking, had told its tale with each crimson drop. But Miss Marple suspected that the full story was only beginning to unfold, and that the secrets hidden beneath the placid surface of St. Mary Mead were far more complex than a simple case of village spite gone wrong. The sound of motor car tires on gravel announced the arrival of Inspector Slack from Much Benham, his official vehicle cutting through the evening air with businesslike efficiency. A compact, energetic man with shrewd eyes and an unfortunate tendency toward hasty conclusions, Inspector Slack emerged from his car already reaching for his notebook. Behind him came Sergeant Lake, a younger officer whose eager demeanor suggested this was likely his first murder investigation. Constable Troughton hurried forward with visible relief, launching into a somewhat disjointed account of the evening's events. Inspector Slack listened with half his attention, while his experienced gaze swept the scene, taking in the covered form of Mrs. Hargreaves, the telltale stains on the white tablecloth, and the ominous burgundy stocking still hanging from the clothesline above. "Right then," he announced briskly, cutting through Troughton's stammering report. "Let's have the facts, Dr. Haydock. What are we dealing with?" Dr. Haydock stepped forward, his professional composure intact despite the unusual circumstances. "Puncture wound at the base of the skull, Inspector. Very precise placement. The weapon was a hat-pin with a coral head, concealed within that burgundy stocking. I suspect poison was involved as well. Note the slight discoloration around the lips." Inspector Slack bent to examine the wound himself, his movements surprisingly gentle for such a brusque man. "Clever bit of work," he admitted grudgingly. "Someone with a theatrical mind, or perhaps just very practical thinking. The stocking served as both hiding place and timing device." Miss Marple, still positioned unobtrusively near the elm tree, observed the inspector's methods with interest. She noted how his attention moved systematically from the physical evidence to the gathered villagers, cataloguing potential suspects with the efficiency of long experience. When his gaze briefly met hers, She detected a flicker of recognition. Inspector Slack had encountered village ladies who knitted and observed before. "Now then," the inspector continued, pulling out a considerably larger notebook than Constable Troughton's modest affair. "I'll need statements from everyone who was near the clothing stall or had contact with Mrs. Hargreaves during the afternoon. Step forward, please." A reluctant shuffle ensued as the principal witnesses arranged themselves for questioning. Timothy Fletcher moved forward first, still clutching his unfortunate prize, his face pale in the lantern light. Mrs. Pemberton leaned heavily on her husband's arm, while Mr. Lacey adjusted his spectacles with the deliberate precision of a man preparing to choose his words carefully. "You first, Mr. Fletcher," Inspector Slack said, his pencil poised. "You won these red stockings in the raffle, I understand. Tell me about your afternoon." Timothy's voice shook slightly as he recounted the events, his distress evident as he described Mrs. Hargreaves's public humiliation of him. "She said I was collecting worthless investments, Inspector, in front of everyone. It was mortifying, but I wouldn't hurt her for it. I was standing well away when it happened." Miss Marple noted the young man's muddy shoes and the fresh scuff on the left toe, evidence of nervous pacing or perhaps something more significant. His hands trembled as he spoke, but whether from guilt or genuine shock remained to be determined. Mrs. Pemberton's testimony came in whispered fragments. "The stockings were donated in good faith, Inspector. Our supplier assured us they were finest quality silk. Mrs. Hargreaves was quite wrong to question them publicly. It was devastating for our reputation." "Devastating enough to take action?" Inspector Slack inquired with characteristic bluntness. Mr. Pemberton's arm tightened protectively around his wife. "Inspector, Agnes has never harmed anyone in her life. The suggestion is preposterous." But Miss Marple observed the couple's exchange of glances, the way Mrs. Pemberton's lips moved silently as if rehearsing explanations. There was more to their distress than simple business concerns, she was certain. Mr. Lacey's statement was measured and precise. "I was examining a rather fine waistcoat that had been donated, Inspector. 19th century, excellent workmanship. I appreciate quality items, a habit developed through years in the legal profession." "Quite the collector, are you, sir?" "I observe details, Inspector. It's essential in my line of work." Mr. Lacey's emphasis on the word observe seemed almost pointed, as if he were drawing attention to his own powers of observation. As the questioning continued, Inspector Slack methodically worked through each witness. Colonel Melchett provided a military man's precise account. Mrs. Bantry offered her observations with characteristic directness, and the Reverend Clement confirmed the timeline with clerical accuracy. Throughout it all, Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm, her presence so unobtrusive that she seemed almost invisible. This suited her perfectly, allowing her to observe not merely what people said, but how they said it, and more importantly, what they carefully avoided saying altogether. The evening shadows had deepened considerably by the time Inspector Slack concluded his preliminary interviews, and Miss Marple found herself particularly intrigued by the pattern emerging from the testimonies. 3 individuals had shown unusual interest in the clothing stall, each possessed potential motives for resenting Mrs. Hargreaves, and each displayed behavior suggesting they were concealing something significant. But there was something else nagging at her consciousness. The almost theatrical nature of the crime itself suggested a mind that was not merely vengeful, but genuinely calculating. Inspector Slack's satisfaction with the evening's work was evident in his brisk movements as he supervised the collection of evidence. The burgundy stocking, with its grisly secret now revealed, was carefully bagged alongside the coral-headed hat-pin that had served as both weapon and accusation. Timothy Fletcher stood pale and trembling beside Sergeant Lake, the red stockings he had won still clutched in his nerveless fingers like some macabre trophy. "Clear case of motive and opportunity," Inspector Slack announced to Dr. Haydock, his notebook snapping shut with finality. "Public humiliation followed by immediate access to the weapon. The lad had both the provocation and the means. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm as she observed the inspector's confident assessment. While Timothy Fletcher certainly appeared guilty, his distress was genuine enough. Something about the entire scenario struck her as almost theatrical in its obviousness. The young man's reaction seemed more consistent with shock and bewilderment than the calculated satisfaction of successful revenge. Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, had been examining Mrs. Hargreaves' cream felt hat, which Sergeant Lake had retrieved from beneath her chair. "Inspector," he said quietly, "you might find this interesting. The hatpin that killed her, it came from her own hat. See here?" He indicated a small empty hole in the ribbon band, positioned directly beside an identical hatpin with a matching coral head. "Inspector," Slack's eyebrows rose with professional interest. "Economical, that. No need to bring a weapon to the scene when the victim provides it herself." "Indeed," Miss Marple observed mildly, though her tone carried a note that made the inspector glance in her direction. Though one might wonder at the forethought required to know that Mrs. Hargreaves would be wearing that particular hat and that it would contain a suitable weapon. The implication hung in the evening air like smoke from the dying lanterns. Inspector Slack frowned, his certainty wavering slightly as he considered the logistics. "Are you suggesting premeditation, Miss Marple? Jane Marple?" "I'm suggesting nothing more than observation, Inspector. Mrs. Hargreaves was quite particular about her appearance. She wore that cream felt hat to every village function. It matched her usual ensemble perfectly. Anyone familiar with her habits might have known to expect it." Mrs. Clement, who had been hovering nearby with the anxious air of someone whose peaceful world had been shattered, stepped forward hesitantly. "If I might mention, Inspector, Mrs. Hargreaves did complain of feeling rather faint during the afternoon. Mrs. Price Ridley was kind enough to offer her smelling salts." "Smelling salts?" Inspector Slack's attention sharpened immediately. "Where are they now?" Mrs. Price Ridley, summoned by his authoritative tone, confirmed the loan with characteristic precision. "A small crystal bottle, Inspector. She placed it in her cream reticule, the one with the silk tassel. Said the heat was making her feel quite peculiar." But when Sergeant Lake examined the reticule in question, he found only Mrs. Hargreaves' handkerchief, a small powder compact, and the evening's raffle program. The smelling salts had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Miss Marple found this development particularly intriguing, especially when she noticed the way Mrs. Pemberton's hands had tightened on her own reticule at the mention of the missing bottle. The shop owner's distress seemed to encompass far more than simple horror at the evening's events, and her husband's protective hovering suggested they both understood implications that had not yet occurred to Inspector Slack. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the bottle simply fell during the confusion. Such small items have a way of disappearing at the most inconvenient moments." But even as she spoke, her sharp eyes were cataloguing the various reactions around her. Mr. Lacey had begun cleaning his spectacles with unusual vigor, his attention seemingly focused on removing non-existent smudges. Timothy Fletcher's muddy shoes bore evidence of considerable pacing, though whether from guilt or anxiety remained to be determined. Most telling of all was Mrs. Pemberton's pallor, which had increased noticeably since the mention of medical knowledge and anatomical precision. Inspector Slack, however, remained focused on his chosen suspect. Medical training or not, Mr. Fletcher had the clearest motive. A young man's pride is a dangerous thing when publicly wounded. "Oh, but Inspector," Miss Marple continued in her most innocent tone, "might we not consider that Mrs. Hargreaves was rather forceful in her opinions about quality and authenticity? Such certainty can be quite threatening to those whose reputations depend on maintaining certain standards." The observation fell among the gathered villagers with the weight of uncomfortable truth. Mrs. Hargreaves had indeed been known for her expertise in textiles and household goods, often called upon to authenticate items for insurance purposes or estate sales. Her pronouncements carried considerable authority in matters of quality and value. Mrs. Pemberton's sharp intake of breath was audible in the evening stillness, and Miss Marple noted how her husband's protective grip on her arm tightened instinctively. There were clearly depths to this tragedy that extended far beyond Timothy Fletcher's public humiliation. As Inspector Slack prepared to escort his primary suspect to the station for formal questioning, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with quiet satisfaction. The investigation had revealed its first layer of complexity, but she suspected that the full truth lay buried beneath several more strata of village secrets and carefully maintained deceptions. The burgundy stocking had told its tale with each crimson drop, but the complete story was only beginning to emerge from the shadows of St. Mary Mead's seemingly placid surface. The evening air had grown distinctly cooler, and the cheerful remnants of the garden fete seemed almost mockingly festive in the gathering darkness. As the official investigation prepared to follow its predictable course, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the intricate web of relationships and resentments that lay hidden beneath the village's genteel facade. Someone among them was a very clever killer indeed, and she intended to discover exactly who. The exodus from the vicarage lawn began in subdued, broken streams as the villagers dispersed into the gathering darkness, their festive evening transformed into something they would remember with a shudder for years to come. Timothy Fletcher, flanked by Sergeant Lake, was led toward Inspector Slack's motor car, with the resigned air of a man who had accepted his fate, though his pale face suggested he still could not quite comprehend how the evening had taken such a dreadful turn. "You'll have your chance to explain yourself properly, lad," Inspector Slack said, his tone carrying an unexpected note of kindness. "Formal questions at the station, that's all for now." Miss Marple observed the young man's departure with thoughtful attention, noting how his gaze lingered not on Mrs. Hargreaves' covered form, but on the clothesline where the remaining garments still fluttered in the evening breeze. There was something in his expression that spoke more of bewilderment than guilt, though she kept this observation to herself for the moment. Dr. Haydock, securing his medical bag with practiced efficiency, paused beside her chair. "Death would have been nearly instantaneous with the right dosage," he murmured quietly. "Swift collapse, minimal bleeding from the wound itself. That dripping from the stocking was more theatrical than practical. A sign of concealment rather than the cause of death." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed gently, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. "And theatrical gestures often tell us more about their creators than about their intended audience." As Inspector Slack's motor car disappeared into the night, Constable Troughton received his final instructions with the solemnity of a man suddenly thrust into responsibilities far beyond his usual scope. The remaining helpers began the melancholy task of restoring order to what had been such a cheerful scene only hours before. "If you wouldn't mind, Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement said, her voice trembling slightly, "perhaps we might take down what remains of the clothing display. I cannot bear to see it all hanging there like some dreadful reminder." Miss Marple rose with the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve energy for more important battles. "Of course, dear, though we should certainly ask Constable Troughton's permission before disturbing anything that might be considered evidence." The constable, grateful for guidance in unfamiliar territory, readily agreed to supervised clean-up, provided they avoided the immediate area around the burgundy stocking and its ghastly secret. Miss Marple and Mrs. Clement worked together in companionable silence, folding the remaining garments with the methodical care of women accustomed to making order from chaos. As her fingers moved over the various fabrics, Miss Marple's trained eye catalogued details that others might have overlooked. The remaining burgundy stocking, now hanging alone and forlorn, displayed a heel construction that differed subtly from what she remembered of its partner, fewer reinforcing rows, a slightly different tension in the ribbing. How curious that a supposedly matched pair should reveal such inconsistencies upon closer examination. Her attention was drawn to a small irregularity on the clothesline post itself. a tiny snag of thread, pale and fine, caught in a splinter no larger than a thorn. The thread possessed the particular quality associated with the finest haberdashery labels, the sort used to mark superior merchandise. "Constable Troughton," she called softly, her voice carrying just enough authority to command immediate attention. "I believe this might be worth preserving with your other evidence. It may prove to be nothing, of course, but one never knows what small details might prove significant." The constable, relieved to have something concrete to manage, produced an envelope and carefully collected the thread under Miss Marple's gentle supervision. She noted with interest how Mrs. Pemberton's lips pressed together at the mention of haberdashery labels, while Mr. Lacey's eyes sharpened behind his spectacles with what might have been professional recognition. As they worked, Miss Marple found herself examining Mrs. Hargreaves's abandoned reticule, which still rested beside the chair where tragedy had struck. Without disturbing the contents, she had long ago learned to respect both police procedures and feminine privacy. She lifted the small silk tassel that adorned the cream-colored bag. A faint but unmistakable scent of ammonia rose to her nostrils, sharp and recent, quite distinct from the usual potpourri of powder and lavender one might expect. The missing-smelling salts had indeed been present, their medicinal sharpness lingering like an accusation in the evening air. Yet the bottle itself had vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving only this ghostly trace of its presence. Dr. Haydock, preparing to depart, shared one final observation. "If Inspector Slack inquires, I shall report that preliminary findings suggest a soluble alkaloid rather than anything corrosive. No tissue burns, you see. Someone possessed considerable knowledge of what would act swiftly and efficiently." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles never pausing in their gentle rhythm. "Then we must look for either a remarkably fortunate opportunist or a deliberately calculating mind. In my experience, Inspector, luck is seldom quite so tidy in its arrangements." The following morning brought a grey dampness to St. Mary Mead that seemed to mirror the sombre mood settling over the village like a funeral shroud. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night turning over the evening's events in her mind, positioned herself at her cottage window to observe the subtle changes that tragedy had wrought upon their usual rhythms. Pemberton's shop, typically punctual in its 8 o'clock opening, remained shuttered well past 9, while Mrs. Pemberton could be glimpsed through the upper windows, her movements agitated and purposeless. A sharp rap at her door announced Mrs. Bantry's arrival, her usually robust complexion pale with excitement and anxiety. "Jane, you must tell me what you think of this dreadful business," she declared, settling into the sitting room with barely contained energy. "I've been to see poor Mrs. Clement, and the most extraordinary things have emerged." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, while Mrs. Bantry launched into her morning's discoveries. It seems Mrs. Hargreaves had been making detailed inquiries about the Pembertons' business practices. She was corresponding with a textile expert in London, quite concerned about certain items being misrepresented to customers. What appeared to be social spite was actually the culmination of a serious investigation into commercial fraud. This intelligence cast the previous evening's dispute in an entirely new light. Mrs. Hargreaves' pointed comments about worthless investments and her insistence on calling things by their proper names suddenly carried far more weight than mere social correction. "And there's more," Mrs. Bantry continued conspiratorially. "Young Fletcher has been released. Dr. Haydock told Arthur that the poison would have acted within minutes, yet Fletcher was clearly visible to multiple witnesses during the critical period. Inspector Slack is now considering that someone else orchestrated this affair, using Fletcher as an unwitting distraction." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily as she processed this development. The theatrical nature of the crime had troubled her from the beginning, the hatpin deliberately placed in the burgundy stocking, dripping its ghastly message like some macabre stage effect. Such elaborate planning suggested a mind that took satisfaction in complexity, in the artful arrangement of clues and misdirection. Timothy Fletcher, for all his obvious distress, seemed too guileless for such calculated malice. The missing smelling salts particularly intrigued her. Mrs. Price Ridley had been quite clear about lending them to Mrs. Hargreaves, and the lingering ammonia scent in the reticule confirmed their presence. Yet the bottle had vanished completely, a deliberate removal that suggested someone who understood its potential significance as evidence. After Mrs. Bantry departed, Miss Marple decided that a visit to Pemberton's shop was essential. Not to interrogate naturally, but merely to purchase some darning wool. Such innocent errands often provided the most fertile ground for observation. The bell over Pemberton's door tinkled with domestic cheer that failed to reach Mrs. Pemberton's eyes. She looked as though she had slept in fragments, while her husband maintained the rigid posture of a man braced for disaster. "Good morning, Mrs. Pemberton," Miss Marple said with gentle sympathy. "Such a dreadful shock for everyone. Perhaps you could advise me about stockings for my niece. She's particular about reinforced heels. I noticed such variety at yesterday's fete." A shadow crossed Mrs. Pemberton's face at the mention of stockings. "A mistake," she said too quickly. "We placed sample pairs from a mixed consignment with the donations. I meant to keep the better ones for a private customer." Miss Marple's gaze drifted over the shop's displays, noting a gap in the hat-pin tray where coral-headed pins should have been. "So pretty," she observed. "I suppose Mrs. Hargreaves favored them." "Regular as clockwork," Mr. Pemberton answered. "The missing set was sold only yesterday morning." As Miss Marple examined a display of crystal smelling salts bottles, she noted Mrs. Pemberton's fluttered response about donating one to the fete hamper. Most tellingly, when purchasing fine tying thread for a parcel, the pale silken cord matched exactly what she had observed caught on the clothesline post. Stepping back into the grey morning, Miss Marple reflected that good order sometimes served as a coverlet tucked smooth over a very rumpled bed. Somewhere beneath that careful surface, a hand had moved with deliberate precision, choosing a hatpin, switching stockings, tidying away incriminating evidence. The pattern was becoming clearer, though the full picture remained tantalizingly incomplete. The grey afternoon brought Inspector Slack's motor car back to St. Mary Mead, its engine cutting through the village quiet with the authority of official business. Miss Marple observed his arrival from her cottage window, noting the determined set of his shoulders as he emerged, a man whose initial theory had been thoroughly demolished by inconvenient facts. Within the hour, word had spread with characteristic village efficiency that Timothy Fletcher had been released, the toxicology results having revealed both the sophistication of the poison used and the impossibility of his having administered it. Dr. Haydock's revised timeline placed the fatal dose well before the raffle drawing, during the earlier afternoon when multiple suspects had enjoyed easy access to Mrs. Hargreaves. The alkaloid in question required considerable expertise to obtain and administer, far beyond the capabilities of a distraught bank clerk seeking revenge for public humiliation. Miss Marple was contemplating these developments when Mrs. Clement appeared at her garden gate, her gentle features marked by obvious distress. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you might spare a moment. Something rather troubling has come to light, and I find myself quite at sea about what to do." In Miss Marple's sitting room, Mrs. Clement produced a small leather notebook from her reticule with trembling hands. "I found this among the donated items when we were clearing up last evening. It was tucked inside a knitted tea cozy, and I'm afraid I didn't notice it until this morning when I was sorting through everything properly." The notebook bore Mrs. Hargreaves's distinctive monogram in gold leaf, its pages filled with meticulous records written in her precise handwriting, dates, suppliers, fabric analyses, and correspondence with textile experts. The entries painted a picture of systematic investigation that extended far beyond casual interest in quality control. She was building a case, Miss Marple observed quietly, turning the pages with careful attention. "Look here. Detailed records of silk content, dye analysis, even photographs of fabric weaves. This represents months of careful documentation. The implications were staggering. Mrs. Hargreaves had been corresponding with experts at the Victoria and Albert Museum, submitting fabric samples for professional analysis. The results were damning, multiple instances of inferior materials being sold as premium goods, systematic mislabeling that constituted deliberate fraud rather than innocent error. Most significantly, the final entries detailed her intention to present these findings to the local magistrate on Monday, just 3 days after the garden fete. Miss Marple found herself studying a particular entry dated 1 week before the fete. Mrs. Hargreaves had noted the delivery of a new consignment to Pemberton's shop, including several pairs of stockings marked as finest silk, but displaying characteristics consistent with cheaper alternatives. She had even sketched the distinctive heel construction that Miss Marple had observed the previous evening. "Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe Inspector Slack must certainly see this, but perhaps we might first visit Mr. Lacey. He mentioned yesterday that Mrs. Hargreaves had hinted about local items not being what they seemed." They found Mr. Lacey in his book-lined study, surrounded by legal tomes and county maps. His greeting carried its usual urbanity, though Miss Marple detected a subtle tension beneath his composed exterior. "A most distressing business at the fete," he said, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "Though I confess it has provided a rather stimulating intellectual exercise." Miss Marple settled into a comfortable armchair, her manner deceptively casual. "I find myself wondering about the precise timing of events. Dr. Haydock mentioned the poison would have acted swiftly. One would need to be very close to Mrs. Hargreaves at the exact moment." "Precisely." Mr. Lacey nodded, stroking his chin thoughtfully, "which rather complicates matters for our young Mr. Fletcher, doesn't it?" "And the missing smelling salts bottle," Miss Marple ventured, watching him carefully. "A curious detail, wouldn't you say? Especially given Mrs. Hargreaves's complaint of feeling faint." A flicker of something, recognition, apprehension, crossed Mr. Lacey's face, quickly masked by his usual composure. "An interesting thought, Miss Marple. One that hadn't occurred to Inspector Slack, I dare say. I have often found," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but firm, "that people with a keen eye for detail often notice things that others overlook, like the quality of thread, perhaps, or the construction of a stocking." Mr. Lacey stiffened almost imperceptibly, clearing his throat with studied casualness. "One tries to be observant, Miss Marple. Details, you see, are everything in the law. They can make or break a case. They can also," Miss Marple concluded, her eyes fixed on his, "reveal hidden motives and long-buried secrets, especially when those secrets involve matters of authenticity and value." As they took their leave, Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Hargreaves had not been the victim of sudden passion, but rather the target of a carefully planned elimination. Someone had known about her investigation, understood the threat it represented, and had acted with cold calculation to prevent its completion. The tranquil surface of St. Mary Mead concealed currents far more treacherous than village spite. The leather notebook's revelations had transformed Inspector Slack's understanding entirely, and by the following morning, his motor car was once again making its purposeful way through St. Mary Mead's quiet streets. Miss Marple observed his arrival from her cottage window, noting the determined set of his shoulders, a man whose case had been rebuilt from the ground up, this time on far more solid foundations. She was not surprised when Mrs. Clement appeared at her garden gate shortly thereafter, her gentle features marked by obvious concern. "Miss Marple, Inspector Slack has asked if you might join him at Pemberton's shop. He seems to think your observations could prove valuable." They found the inspector already examining the shop's interior with the methodical attention of a man who now understood what he was looking for. The bell's cheerful tinkle seemed almost impertinent as they entered, and Mr. Pemberton emerged from the back room with the rigid dignity of someone bracing for disaster. "Inspector," he began, but Slack raised a hand for silence. "We'll be conducting a thorough search, Mr. Pemberton," Mrs. Hargreaves's notebook has proved most illuminating regarding your business practices. He gestured to Sergeant Lake, who disappeared through the curtained doorway to the back room. Miss Marple positioned herself near the counter, her knitting needles beginning their familiar rhythm as she observed the various reactions. Mrs. Pemberton had gone quite pale, her hands twisting nervously in her apron, while her husband maintained his defensive posture with increasing difficulty. Sergeant Lake's voice carried from the back room. "Inspector, you'll want to see this." They found him standing beside a workbench that told its own story. A small pot of adhesive sat open, its contents still tacky, while a neat stack of premium quality labels bore the distinctive printing that Miss Marple recognized from yesterday's disputed stockings. More tellingly, a faint but unmistakable scent of ammonia hung in the air, not strong enough to be smelling salts, but suggestive of recent cleaning efforts. "Relabeling supplies," Inspector Slack observed grimly, just as Mrs. Hargreaves suspected. Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to a scrap basket in the corner, where curls of burgundy fabric caught the morning light. She approached with casual interest, noting the clean cuts that suggested deliberate trimming rather than accidental waste. "Such a lovely color," she remarked innocently, "though I notice only one stocking's worth of trimmings. How curious." Mrs. Pemberton's sharp intake of breath was audible in the small room, and her husband's protective grip on her arm tightened instinctively. There were clearly depths to this tragedy that extended far beyond simple business fraud. The bell tinkled again, announcing Timothy Fletcher's hesitant entrance. He started visibly at the sight of Inspector Slack, then squared his shoulders with the determination of someone resolved to do the right thing, regardless of consequences. "I've come to return these, sir," he said quietly, holding out the red stockings that had been his unfortunate prize. "They weren't properly won, what with everything that's happened. I can't keep them." Inspector Slack accepted the stockings with professional interest, examining them carefully in the morning light. Miss Marple noted his attention to the heel construction. The slightly different tension she had observed the previous evening was even more apparent in daylight. "Interesting workmanship," the inspector observed. "Not quite a matched pair, are they?" Mrs. Pemberton reached instinctively toward the stockings, her movement far too quick for mere politeness. Inspector Slack's hand intercepted hers with practiced efficiency. "We'll take charge of those, Mrs. Pemberton. Evidence, you understand?" It was then that Mr. Lacey appeared in the doorway, his arrival timed with the precision of someone who had been watching the proceedings from a distance. "Inspector Slack," he said with his customary urbanity, though Miss Marple detected the subtle tension beneath his composed exterior. "I trust the Pembertons are being treated fairly. Old habits, you know. I feel compelled to ensure proper legal procedures are followed." "Quite proper, Mr. Lacey," Inspector Slack replied evenly. "Though I wonder if you might clarify your own involvement with authentication services in the village. Mrs. Hargreaves's notebook mentions several instances requiring expert testimony." A flicker of something, recognition, apprehension, crossed Mr. Lacey's face before his professional mask reasserted itself. "I occasionally provide advice on legal matters involving valuations. Nothing irregular, I assure you." Miss Marple's sharp eyes had caught a detail that others might have overlooked. A tiny fragment of coral-colored material caught in the seam of Mr. Lacey's glove, crumbly and irregular like a bead that had seen rough handling. She filed this observation away while maintaining her innocent demeanor. "Of course," she said gently, "expertise in authentication would require considerable knowledge of materials and their properties, the sort of knowledge that might extend to understanding chemical tests for fabric composition." The effect of her words was immediate and telling. Mr. Lacey's hands stilled completely, and Mrs. Pemberton's face went from pale to ashen. Inspector Slack, who had learned to pay attention to Miss Marple's seemingly casual observations, stepped closer to examine Mr. Lacey's gloves with professional interest. "Perhaps," Miss Marple continued in her most innocent tone, We might also clarify the matter of Mrs. Price Ridley's smelling salts. Such a small thing, really, but curious how completely they disappeared after being lent in good faith. The morning light streaming through Pemberton's shop. Windows seemed to illuminate more than mere dust motes. It revealed the intricate web of deception that had been carefully constructed around the simple business of selling stockings and household goods. Someone among them possessed not only the motive to silence Mrs. Hargreaves, but the calculating intelligence to orchestrate her elimination with theatrical precision. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle clicking as she prepared to observe, with the patience that had served her so well in the past, exactly how each person present would react when the full weight of evidence finally came to bear upon their carefully maintained secrets. The coral fragments scattered across the shop floor seemed to catch the morning light like tiny accusations, each piece telling its own small story of guilt and deception. Inspector Slack bent to examine them with the methodical attention of a man who had learned to read evidence like scripture, while Mr. Lacey maintained his urbane composure with increasing difficulty. "Fascinating," the inspector murmured, using his pencil to separate the fragments. "Some of these have a distinctly chalky quality, not quite the luster one expects from genuine coral." He glanced up at Mr. Lacey with professional interest. "You mentioned handling Mrs. Hargreaves's effects yesterday evening?" "Quite naturally," Mr. Lacey replied, his voice carrying its customary authority despite the circumstances. "One felt compelled to examine the wound, to understand how such a tragedy could occur. Professional curiosity, you might say." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she observed the subtle interplay of question and answer. Something about Mr. Lacey's explanation struck her as carefully prepared, too smooth for genuine spontaneity. She noted how his right hand remained curiously still, while his left gestured with practiced eloquence, an unconscious habit that spoke of concealment. It was then that Sergeant Lake made his discovery, reaching into Mr. Lacey's leather attaché case with the systematic thoroughness of official procedure. The small crystal bottle he withdrew caught the light with unmistakable clarity, its contents still redolent with the sharp tang of ammonia. "Well, well," Inspector Slack said softly. "Mrs. Price Ridley's smelling salts, unless I'm very much mistaken." The effect on the assembled company was immediate and telling. Mrs. Pemberton's hand flew to her throat, while her husband's protective grip on her arm tightened instinctively. Most significantly, Mr. Lacey's careful composure showed its first genuine crack, a momentary tightening around the eyes that suggested calculations being rapidly revised. "I retrieved it during the confusion," Mr. Lacey explained with studied calm. "One could hardly leave such evidence lying about for curious villagers to contaminate. I intended to present it to you this morning." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple observed mildly, though her sharp eyes had caught something others might have overlooked. "Though I wonder, might Inspector Slack examine your right hand as well, Mr. Lacey? In my experience, people often forget their dominant hand when attempting to tidy away inconvenient traces." The suggestion carried the gentle authority that had served Miss Marple so well in the past, and Inspector Slack responded with the instinctive cooperation of a professional who had learned to value unexpected insights. Mr. Lacey's right hand, when reluctantly extended, revealed a small but telling puncture wound on the index finger, accompanied by fragments of the same pale thread Miss Marple had observed on the clothesline post. The shop's bell announced another arrival. Mrs. Price Ridley, summoned by official request, her bearing as crisp and decisive as a military inspection. "My smelling salts," she declared upon seeing the crystal bottle. "I'd know that green ribbon anywhere. My maid insisted on tying it, though I thought it quite unnecessary." "And when did you last see this bottle, Mrs. Price Ridley?" Inspector Slack inquired. "Yesterday afternoon, naturally. Mrs. Hargreaves complained of feeling faint. The heat, you know, and I was happy to lend assistance. A lady must always be prepared for such eventualities." Timothy Fletcher, who had been standing quietly near the door throughout the morning's revelations, suddenly stepped forward with the expression of someone experiencing a moment of uncomfortable clarity. "Mr. Lacey," he said hesitantly, "weren't you the one who suggested examining that burgundy stocking so carefully? Right after we found Mrs. Hargreaves, you seem to know exactly what we'd discover." The observation fell among them like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of implication through the assembled company. Miss Marple recalled the scene vividly: Mr. Lacey's immediate focus on the clothesline, his professional interest in what he had termed delayed revelation, and most tellingly, his apparent familiarity with the concept of using everyday objects for purposes far removed from their innocent appearance. "One develops an eye for significant details," Mr. Lacey replied, though his voice carried a note of strain that had not been present earlier. "Years in the legal profession teach one to notice patterns that others might overlook." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed gently. "And I imagine your expertise in authentication would require considerable knowledge of materials and their properties, the sort of knowledge that might extend to understanding the difference between genuine articles and their more economical alternatives." The words carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate evidence, touching on matters of professional reputation and commercial integrity. Mrs. Pemberton's face had gone quite pale, while her husband maintained the rigid posture of a man braced for revelations he could no longer prevent. Inspector Slack was now examining the smelling salts bottle with renewed interest, noting how its contents had been disturbed, the liquid level slightly lower than one might expect from casual use. Dr. Haydock mentioned that the poison would have required a liquid medium for effective administration, he observed thoughtfully. Something readily absorbed through mucous membranes. "Ammonia solutions are remarkably versatile," Miss Marple added with innocent precision. "They can dissolve so many substances while maintaining their characteristic sharp scent. Most useful for concealing other odors that might prove inconvenient." Mr. Lacey's laugh held a brittle quality that spoke of carefully maintained facades beginning to crumble under sustained pressure. "Really, Inspector, you're constructing quite an elaborate theory from the most circumstantial evidence. I trust you'll require rather more substantial proof before making formal accusations." But the evidence was mounting with inexorable logic. The coral fragments that proved to be artificial rather than genuine, the missing smelling salts that had reappeared in suspicious circumstances, the physical traces of hasty manipulation, and most damning of all, the pattern of knowledge and opportunity that pointed toward calculated premeditation rather than crimes of passion. As the morning light continued to stream through Pemberton's shop windows, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the intricate web of deception that had been so carefully constructed around the simple business of village commerce. Someone among them had possessed not only the motive to silence Mrs. Hargreaves, but the calculating intelligence to orchestrate her elimination with theatrical precision, using the very symbols of community trust, smelling salts, hatpins, and stockings, as instruments of deliberate murder. The truth was emerging like a photograph developing in chemical solution, each detail becoming clearer as the proper light was applied. Soon, very soon, the complete picture would stand revealed in all its calculated malevolence. The coral fragments scattered across the shop floor seemed to multiply under Inspector Slack's methodical examination, each piece telling its own small story of calculated deception. Miss Marple observed the assembled company with the patient attention of someone who understood that truth often emerged not through dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet accumulation of undeniable evidence. "Composition coral," Dr. Haydock confirmed, having arrived to examine the fragments with professional thoroughness. "Quite skillfully made, but unmistakably artificial once one knows what to look for. The sort of thing that might fool a casual observer, but would never withstand expert scrutiny." Inspector Slack's attention had sharpened considerably as he consulted Mrs. Hargreaves' notebook. According to her correspondence, She had arranged for professional authentication of several items you had valued, Mr. Lacey. Items that proved to be significantly less valuable than your assessment suggested. The effect of this revelation rippled through the shop like stones thrown into still water. Mrs. Pemberton's face had gone quite pale, while her husband maintained the rigid posture of a man braced for disasters he could no longer prevent. Most significantly, Mr. Lacey's carefully maintained composure showed hairline cracks that spoke of foundations beginning to crumble under sustained pressure. Professional authentication is always subject to revision, Mr. Lacey replied, though his voice carried a note of strain that had not been present earlier. One does one's best with the available information, but expertise evolves. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she considered the intricate pattern emerging before them. Indeed, Mr. Lacey, though I imagine Mrs. Hargreaves's investigation extended beyond mere differences of professional opinion. Her notebook suggests she had documented a rather systematic approach to, shall we say, creative valuation. Timothy Fletcher, who had been listening with the fascinated horror of someone witnessing the collapse of everything he had believed about his quiet village, suddenly stepped forward. "The burgundy stockings," he said hesitantly. "You examined them so carefully yesterday evening, Mr. Lacey. You seemed to know exactly what we would find when we looked at that clothesline." The observation fell among them with the weight of uncomfortable truth. Miss Marple recalled the scene vividly. Mr. Lacey's immediate focus on the dripping stocking, his apparent familiarity with what he had termed delayed revelation, and most tellingly, his professional interest in what others had seen as merely macabre theatricality. "One develops an eye for significant details," Mr. Lacey said carefully. "Years in the legal profession teach one to notice patterns that others might overlook." "Patterns, yes," Miss Marple agreed gently, "such as the pattern of Mrs. Hargreaves's habits, her cream felt hat with its matching coral-headed hat pins, her tendency to feel faint at social gatherings, her regular borrowing of smelling salts from Mrs. Price Ridley. Someone familiar with village life would know to expect such things." Inspector Slack was now examining the crystal bottle with renewed interest, noting how its contents had been disturbed. "Dr. Haydock, would ammonia serve as an effective carrier for the sort of alkaloid poison you mentioned?" "Remarkably so," the doctor confirmed grimly. "The sharp scent would mask other odors, while the liquid would provide an ideal medium for absorption through mucous membranes. A few drops of the right solution, mixed with the existing ammonia, would act swiftly and leave minimal traces." The technical discussion seemed to affect Mrs. Pemberton more than the assembled evidence. Her hands twisted in her apron with increasing violence, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of accumulated guilt and fear. "We never meant for anyone to be hurt," she whispered, her composure finally cracking. "The stockings were good quality, just not quite what we claimed. Mrs. Hargreaves was going to destroy us over a few mislabeled items. 20 years of honest business reduced to nothing." Her husband's protective grip tightened, but the admission had opened floodgates that could not be closed. Inspector Slack leaned forward with professional interest, his notebook poised to capture whatever revelations might follow. "Julian said there was a way to prevent the whole business from becoming public," Mrs. Pemberton continued, tears streaming down her face. "He understood about chemicals, about how to make it look natural. All we needed to do was provide the opportunity, switch one of the burgundy stockings with our inferior version, ensure she would examine them closely." Mr. Lacey's face had gone quite pale, his urbane composure finally abandoning him entirely. "Agnes, for God's sake, consider what you're saying." But Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through his protest with the authority of absolute understanding. "The smelling salts were the key, weren't they, Mr. Lacey?" Mrs. Hargreaves complained of feeling faint, quite predictably, given the afternoon heat and her tendency toward such episodes. "When she asked for the salts, you saw your opportunity." The shop fell silent except for the distant cawing of rooks and Mrs. Pemberton's quiet sobbing. Miss Marple continued in her most innocent tone, though her blue eyes held depths of steel. "You borrowed the bottle from Mrs. Price Ridley, added your prepared solution to the existing ammonia, then returned it to Mrs. Hargreaves's reticule. When she used it, the poison would be absorbed immediately. No need for direct contact, no obvious weapon. The hatpin was merely insurance, applied while she was already weakening to ensure the desired result." "And the burgundy stocking?" Inspector Slack inquired, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Theatre," Miss Marple replied simply. A dramatic flourish designed to draw attention away from the true method while simultaneously pointing suspicion toward young Mr. Fletcher. The dripping was meant to suggest the hatpin as the primary weapon, concealing the more sophisticated poisoning that had actually occurred. Mr. Lacey sagged against the counter, the weight of his carefully constructed deception finally proving too much to bear. "She would have destroyed us all," he said quietly, his voice carrying the defeat of a man whose defenses had crumbled entirely. "My reputation, my practice, everything I had built over 30 years of careful work, all because of her obsession with absolute truth." Inspector Slack nodded to Sergeant Lake, who stepped forward with the practiced efficiency of official duty. As Mr. Lacey was led away, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with steady hands, though her thoughts remained fixed on the human tragedy that had unfolded in their quiet village. The pursuit of authenticity, she reflected, could indeed be a dangerous thing in a world where appearances were so carefully maintained and underlying truths so often concealed. The stocking that dripped red had told its tale with each crimson drop, but the complete story was one of desperation, calculated murder, and the terrible price of preserving lies that had grown too large to sustain. As the morning light continued to stream through Pemberton's shop windows, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the fragile nature of community trust and the dark currents that could flow beneath even the most placid village surfaces. Mrs. Hargreaves had died for her devotion to truth, but in death she had ensured that the very deceptions she had fought to expose would finally see the light of day. The arrest of Mr. Lacey sent ripples of shock through St. Mary Mead that would be felt for months to come, though by evening the village had begun the peculiar process of absorbing extraordinary events into the fabric of ordinary life. Miss Marple remained in Pemberton's shop long enough to witness Mrs. Pemberton's complete collapse, her husband's protective embrace unable to shield her from the weight of accumulated guilt that had finally found its voice. Inspector Slack's final assessment was characteristically blunt as he supervised the collection of evidence. A case of commercial fraud escalating to murder when exposure threatened carefully constructed reputations, he declared to Dr. Haydock. Mr. Lacey will face charges of premeditated murder, while the Pembertons will answer for conspiracy and their role in the deception that made such desperate measures seem necessary. The inspector's motorcar departed as the afternoon shadows lengthened, carrying Mr. Lacey toward a future that would be decided in courtrooms far from the gentle rhythms of village life. Mrs. Pemberton, sedated by Dr. Haydock's ministrations, had been taken to her sister's cottage, while her husband faced the grim prospect of salvaging what remained of their reputation and livelihood. Timothy Fletcher, his name finally cleared of all suspicion, appeared at Miss Marple's cottage as evening fell. His young face still bore traces of the shock that had aged him considerably over the past few days, but there was relief in his eyes, the profound gratitude of someone who had glimpsed the abyss and been pulled back from its edge. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for seeing through Mr. Lacey's scheme. If you hadn't noticed those small details, the coral fragments, the thread on the clothesline, I might have spent the rest of my life paying for his crime." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded him with gentle sympathy. "Truth has a way of emerging, Mr. Fletcher, though I confess the theatrical nature of the crime troubled me from the beginning. Real passion seldom arranges itself so artfully. When someone takes such care with appearances, one must look beyond the obvious performance to discover the actual play being performed." As Timothy departed, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the various threads that had woven together to create such a tragic tapestry. Mrs. Hargreaves's devotion to absolute honesty, the Pembertons' gradual slide into commercial deception, Mr. Lacey's willingness to authenticate questionable items for profitable relationships. Each thread seemed innocent enough in isolation, but together they had created a pattern that made murder seem almost inevitable. Mrs. Clement appeared at the garden gate as the evening air grew cooler, her gentle features still marked by bewilderment. "Miss Marple, I find myself quite at sea about human nature. How could people we've known for years harbor such darkness?" Miss Marple considered the question with the thoughtfulness it deserved. "I think, my dear, that Mr. Lacey and the Pembertons began with small compromises, a slightly generous valuation here, a charitable interpretation of fabric quality there. Such things seem harmless when they benefit one's neighbors and community. But deception has a way of growing, like bindweed in a garden. Each lie requires another to support it, until the structure becomes so elaborate that preserving it seems more important than maintaining one's integrity." Dr. Haydock joined them as darkness settled over the village, his medical bag suggesting he had been attending to the various emotional casualties that such revelations inevitably produced. "Mrs. Pemberton is genuinely devastated," he reported quietly. "The guilt has been consuming her for months. She truly believed they were providing good value, just not quite the premium quality they claimed." "And Mr. Lacey?" Miss Marple inquired, though her tone suggested she suspected the answer. "Defiant to the end," Dr. Haydock replied grimly. "Claims Mrs. Hargreaves was a meddling busybody who brought her fate upon herself. No remorse whatsoever, only anger at being caught." This revelation cast the crime in an even darker light. Mrs. Hargreaves had died not in a moment of passion or desperate fear, but as the victim of cold calculation by someone who valued his reputation more than human life. The burgundy stocking, with its crimson drops marking time like a ghastly metronome, had been chosen as theatrical flourish with careful deliberation. A dramatic misdirection designed to focus attention on the obvious weapon while concealing the sophisticated poisoning that had actually caused death. As the last light faded from the western sky, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with steady hands, though her thoughts remained fixed on the fragile nature of community trust. St. Mary Mead would recover from this tragedy, as villages always did, but the innocence that had allowed such deceptions to flourish was gone forever. People would examine their neighbors more carefully now, question assumptions that had once seemed unshakable, and perhaps value honesty more highly for having seen the terrible cost of its absence. The stocking that dripped red had told its tale with each crimson drop, revealing not just the method of murder but the moral decay that had made such a crime possible. In death, Mrs. Hargreaves had achieved the vindication denied her in life. The absolute truth she had pursued with such determination had finally emerged, though at a cost no one could have anticipated. Miss Marple tucked her knitting away and rose to go inside, where familiar comforts awaited. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was content to reflect on the eternal struggle between appearance and reality, and the quiet satisfaction that came from seeing justice served, even in the most unlikely circumstances.